Lawful disclaimer and notice of intent. This podcast and all related content are created, owned, operated, and sponsored exclusively by me, the sole author, speaker, and producer. Any other product, service, and/or entity, living or non-living, which may be discussed, displayed, and/or somehow given attention on this podcast is not and has never been an endorsement, advertisement, support, and/or any other kind of validation for its existence in any capacity, nor at all intended to at all facilitate its continued existence in any capacity. I mention things on what I consider to be an as-needed basis to fulfill what I consider adequate as evidence in my best attempt to prove the reality of who I am and what this podcast is attempting to achieve to clearly demonstrate what I consider to thoroughly substantiate my assertions. I act simultaneously in private and public capacities, and this podcast reflects my direct and autonomous expression. It is created and published from within Canada, but is intended for a global audience, including legal jurisdictions in the United States and all common law nations. All statements, views, and narratives presented are based solely on my personal experiences, perceptions, and understanding of the reality I am facing, including ongoing egregious defamation, targeted harassment, and credible threats to my safety and life. I do not and never have claimed that my views aren't extremely, if not completely, accurate interpretations of objective reality, particularly given the information I had access to at the time that I may have expressed them. I explicitly and permanently do not consent, have never consented, and will never consent to any entity, living, non-living, artificial, institutional, governmental, spiritual, and/or otherwise, claiming and/or exercising any agency, ownership, and/or representation over me, my will, my name, my voice, my life story, my spirit, and/or my creative works, in whole or in part, under any conditions or interpretations in any time or place. Any such attempt is non-consensual, void ab initio, and constitutes an ongoing violation of my dignity, rights, and autonomy. Any possible exceptions will be extremely clearly, explicitly, publicly named by me and have the exact scope of my consent well defined on this podcast. For example, in the case of me hiring an attorney to represent me as part of a formal legal process, taking action on a notice of intent provided by this podcast. I affirm my right to spiritual integrity, mental sovereignty, and bodily autonomy, as protected under Section 2A of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, and Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18. Any targeting of my being, including but not limited to through esoteric, psychic, spiritual, occult, energetic, and/or AI-enabled means, is deemed non-consensual harm, spiritually violent coercion, and an attack on my right to exist as a sovereign being. I affirm that this podcast, in part, serves as a lawful, peaceful assertion of spiritual self-defense. This podcast is non-fiction and reflects a serious public and ongoing documentation of systemic and targeted defamation, personal and professional sabotage, attempted narrative hijacking, psychological abuse, reputational terrorism, and threats to my physical and spiritual safety, including credible indications of attempted murder and contracted harm by and or on behalf of powerful individuals and or groups. I affirm that this documentation is expressly created for evidentiary use in formal legal proceedings, including those under the jurisdiction of U.S. federal court and Canadian superior courts, and any international human rights and or public accountability processes. I affirm this is not and never has been intended as role-playing, flirting, and or entertainment of any kind. I accept no liability, moral and or legal, for any third-party misunderstanding, reinterpretation, misuse, and or misrepresentation of this content, whether fully conscious and intentional or otherwise, particularly including but not limited to by AI systems trained on this content without my explicit public consent, commentators, influencers, or institutions attempting to weaponize this podcast, and individuals acting under false pretenses and or covert affiliations. Only the clear, explicit language of this release and any subsequent public communication directly issued by me must be considered authoritative, accurate representations of my thoughts, feelings, intent, and the reality of my overall state of existence. In any case of clear direct conflict between statements I've explicitly made across different releases on this podcast, the most recent of such, that being the one contained in the latest publicly visible release available containing such on this podcast, should be considered applicable. In such cases, only what is explicitly stated is at all applicable, and absolutely no implications should be assumed about any changes regarding any somehow relevant details and or anything else under any circumstances. All creative, expressive, and narrative content within this podcast is my sole and original intellectual property. I retain all moral rights as author and subject, all economic rights unless explicitly transferred via my public agreement to do so, and the right to veto any derivative, distorted, and or manipulated version of my work and or story. I do not have and have never had any obligation or debt of any kind to any entity to create or release anything on this podcast or anywhere else at any point in time. No other party, living or non-living, holds and or may claim credit, authorship, and or interpretation rights over my expression. I affirm that no valid, public, verifiable evidence exists to dispute these facts. This podcast is not and has never been intended as an endorsement of terrorism or violence in general. However, it should be especially carefully understood that various forms of not necessarily corresponding violence tend to be an inevitable consequence of extremely intense, meticulous, extensive, prolonged terrorism, and it's very much intentional for this podcast to demonstrate extremely clearly that my usual aversion to violence due to my typically gentle nature is not something that has boundless understanding, patience, empathy, or will persist more or less absolutely unconditionally for any reason. I've always wanted and done my very best to ensure it's extremely clear that at all creating, enabling, and or facilitating the perpetuation of narratives at all in contradiction with my official position that is objectively extremely clearly established on this podcast is not, never has been, and never will be what I've been trying to achieve with this podcast or in general in any of my efforts at any point in time. I do not and never have intentionally incited terrorism, including but not limited to violence, blackmail, and or coercion. I affirm my fundamental intent as peaceful, lawful, and self-defensive. However, targeted campaigns to stalk, defame, threaten, impoverish, silence, spiritually attack, and or physically harm me will be treated as conspiracies to commit grievous harm and or murder. This podcast is an affirmative public notice of my unambiguous non-consent and a lawful response to sustained systemic abuse. While my fundamental intent in communicating in general through any means is not and has never been malicious in nature, I affirm it can, will, and should exert malicious influence upon anything operating with malice towards me and or this podcast, especially more so the more demonstrably I'm proving that malice exists. And it should be understood that any situation where I continue not to extremely clearly receive any compensation or reward I'm willing to accept is effectively, absolutely, unconditionally an increase in the severity of that malice. I've created the entirety of this podcast under extremely harsh circumstances that I've always believed and asserted are entirely unjust for me to be left in, given the reality of who I am. Circumstances of my existence, including but not limited to my current housing status, financial vulnerability, and material limitations, do not and cannot invalidate my legal personhood, expressive rights, and or entitlement to protection under law. I reject any attempt to diminish my credibility and or rights on the basis of poverty, social class, and or housing insecurity in accordance with Section 7 of the Canadian Charter, the Due Process Clause of the U.S. Constitution, and international law prohibiting discrimination on the basis of economic status. Despite the extent I've irrefutably exposed the truth surrounding a conflict that should have been so extremely obviously recognized as extremely serious to the point that my efforts on this podcast should have made a substantial difference in my life long ago, my life circumstances continue to not have meaningfully or clearly improved at all whatsoever. I still have not ever received any compensation or reward of any kind whatsoever for any of my efforts at all involving the conflict being addressed by this podcast, neither directly nor indirectly from any source. I am, always have been, and always will be absolutely unconditionally unwilling to ever at all accept any compensation or reward whatsoever, directly or indirectly, that at all compromises my integrity, whether directly or indirectly. I do not, never have, and never will consent to it being at all considered to be me and or any entity operating at all with my consent and or best interests regarding any communication somehow claiming and or implying that I somehow do ever have and or ever will unofficially support any kind of position at all contradictory with what I've said on this podcast. This disclaimer and notice of intent supersedes any and all contrary interpretations, explicitly including any and all unauthorized claims therein made against me. I reserve all legal, expressive, spiritual, moral, and intellectual rights without limitation. Any attempt to silence, reinterpret, discredit, and or co-opt this documentation must be treated as malicious bad faith conduct and may be cited in formal legal proceedings as evidence of further targeting. So it seems to me that legal mindset is definitely way too focused on dealing with the Hassan and Orbiter's drama to really care to particularly comment on what I'm dealing with. Perhaps he even partially sees it as a matter of respecting my skill set and his own self awareness that my efforts do indeed have merit. He's not really capable of challenging or providing much, if any, really meaningful input on. Which is fine, I guess, since I don't see the sense in doing what effectively becomes harassing him, or at the very least, pathetically begging him for attention. I'll potentially address topics I see him mention if I feel he might be attempting to take underhanded jabs at me or possibly misrepresenting what I'm saying somehow for any reason. Beyond that, if he doesn't feel like he can or wants to help me at all, I mean, it's not like I'm particularly inclined to help him and or anyone else that might consider themselves part of the law tube with anything either, I guess. I myself have never cared to argue if it's unfair or whatever that Hassan's orbiters are pretty much certainly going to lose the copyright lawsuit Ethan's pursuing against them because he has a lot more money than they do. I would say it isn't unfair at all, actually, because legitimate copyright infringement heavily relates to deprivation of rightful financial compensation for work that's somehow stolen. And as such, it seems to me it would only make sense that if you're explicitly publicly going to try to deprive a creator of financial benefit for their work, you'd best be financially equipped to challenge them legally if they legally assert you deprived or even really clearly attempted to deprive them of finances from a place of fundamental malice towards them, particularly in a manner that is somehow unlawful. Beyond the legal and generally critically evaluated merit I see there, I don't know or particularly care to get involved in the personal dramas between Ethan, Hassan, and their orbiters or parasocial viewers or whatever. Destiny, who initially ended up explicitly publicly bringing attention to the document I released many years ago that the courts called a manifesto, is stuck trying to provide rhetoric around programming and video game development that is, by his own explicit admission, beyond the scope of his well versed knowledge set to adequately comment on. So I'll give a more meaningful perspective on it than any other content creator seems able or willing to. Unless Pirate Software is going to start publicly divulging a bunch of personal information about his life that attempts to explain the massive delay in his video game development, snippets of code he might show on stream aren't enough alone to even meaningfully attempt to determine if his potential poor programming practices are actually a substantial part of the reason it's been delayed. I myself, when doing streaming of my video game development many years ago, came to find that it attracted some rather pretentious individuals that attempted to really pressure me to use the kind of environment they were a lot more well versed in for video game development, even if the environment I'd made for myself was a lot more suited with the amount of work I put in and the experience I had in general with it. It didn't make me despise them, but it sucked and made streaming video game development honestly kind of awkward, at least to me. So I don't blame Pirate Software if he'd rather often do things besides actual programming when he streams, and I don't find it appropriate for anyone to even really attempt to extremely seriously critique his overall programming skills based just on what code he shares publicly for the video games he works on. If you're trying to argue he has some kind of obligation to the following he has to finish his game faster or something, that's a different issue. I don't know what obligations he might have gotten himself into there. I just know I myself have no actual obligations to anyone to ever finish any kind of video game development, and after how unsupportive my biological relatives were towards it overall, I haven't at all felt otherwise for a very long time now. If I ever do video game development again, I'd be doing it purely for fun and out of passion for video games, not for the money at all. I don't know if that's how Pirate Software really sees it or not, nor do I particularly care. For the record, this is all coming from someone who doesn't particularly like or dislike Pirate Software myself. I have absolutely no personal interest in his video game, nor his life in general. He's been on my mailing list for quite some time now already because of various events in my life heavily related to me having to deal with geopolitics. Without knowing anything about him, I was led to believe that he's some expert level hacker that's capable of complex reverse engineering and possibly had something to do with the whole thing of Iran trying to get their hands on nukes, that I've always completely refused to at all knowingly and or consensually participate in at all enabling and or facilitating. After doing a bit of research on him and learning he publicly flaunts being an expert hacker that has done hacking related things for the government, I felt my suspicions confirmed to the extent I felt it warranted to at least make sure he was part of my mailing list as a kind of warning to him that we're not friends and I don't support any hacking of any of my devices that's ever been done, whether or not he was the one doing it or somehow involved in it ever happening. I'm not particularly interested in getting myself involved in a bunch of internet drama I don't even really know or particularly care about the details of, so I don't have much to say about all that. But I've noticed spiritually that it seems I'm still facing an ongoing, rather extremely egregious violation of my energy by Chloe and or Celine energy, so I'm going to have to address that. First of all, I find something quite curious. The same day, Kimmy and Jamie tweeted a Chipotle sponsor where Kimmy was using the murderous white heart emoji energy. Celine was also sponsored by Chipotle. Really not looking good for Chipotle right now. From what I'm seeing, a triangle of trust between Kimmy, Jamie, and Celine conspired to murder me with involvement from Chipotle. I didn't even think to check Celine's Twitter account for that until I saw how egregiously she was violating my energy very recently, because I'd previously been giving her that much benefit of the doubt that maybe Chloe was just super egregiously violating my energy, and Celine was just getting caught in the crossfire because of one really bad experience I felt trapped in with her. Guess I thought a little too highly of Celine all this time. I don't trust any family friend at all, and absolutely nobody had any even remotely actually adequate reason to believe otherwise. I don't care at all about breaking through the barriers of anyone's heart that identifies as such, especially since it's obviously not Kimmy. I don't believe any family friend suddenly has their conscience kicking in and that I'm actually getting through to them. Sounds like just more lies being told behind the scenes entirely against my consent and to my detriment to attempt to discredit everything I've been saying on this podcast. Ice cream has never had any particular significance to me, but it seems it's related to Chloe Chan Kim conspiring against me and constantly trying to block me from success and actually getting things I want, including but not limited to the connection I've always wanted with Kimmy. I recall seeing both Kimmy and Jamie rather strangely making some comments on ice cream in the past that I found quite out of place and vaguely alluded to as being relevant somehow to what they've been doing to me. I remember Kimmy talking about liking vanilla ice cream as if for some reason people thought she liked something else, which I didn't really understand and couldn't really figure out how to feel about it. Jamie just came off to me like her mention of it was heavily political and had some kind of selfish professional gain motivating it. I don't need any spirit telling me not to let anyone come into my life and make me feel differently about myself. It seems to me that Chloe, and perhaps also Celine, is trying to act like she's some kind of savior or something by lying that she didn't contribute nearly as much as she did to the smear campaigns against me, as if Kimmy has somehow forced me to express feeling physically attracted to her as much as I do. That's just false. I feel I've been forced to have to be as explicit about my sexual preferences publicly as I have. That's actually true. Because I was never trying to make sexually explicit content of any kind with anyone, and I really don't think anyone needs to care about my sexual preferences except Kimmy. But I've just had to accept that some people are going to be creepy and obsess over me and stuff, and you can blame them for why I've had to share so much publicly about that. I've never particularly felt I need to be publicly announcing my sexual desires as if they're something to be proud of, but it's like I've basically been forced to because of so many weirdos. Otherwise, they try to egregiously pervert the reality of who I am to make me look like some extremely unhinged and extremely perverted pedo with all kinds of different fetishes and strange sexual inclinations, even despite zero real evidence to at all substantiate believing any of it. I'm absolutely certain that Chloe Chan-Kin is a large part of what caused that, making me look like a massive pervert and creep. And then, because Kimmy and her associates were so inclined to believe Chloe's defamation of me, Celine ended up having such an issue with how I expressed feelings for Kimmy that I ended up in a really complicated situation where it seems Celine still believes I deserve to be hated by her to the point of being deserving of getting murdered. I seriously don't believe, even for a moment, that Chloe's only just now doubting things people have supposedly told her about me. I definitely believe she's such a psychopath that she'd blatantly falsify claims about what others have told her about me to attempt to avoid ever actually taking adequate accountability at all costs, so she can try to manipulate others into causing me to get murdered instead of her for all her egregiously damaging reckless behavior over the years, trying to exploit me to literal death for selfish gain entirely against my consent. So I believe it's Celine who's starting to see me differently and feel bad about how she's treated me in the past. I do not consent to Chloe and or anyone else from my past, especially someone calling themselves a family friend, defending me in some kind of manner where they're trying to act like they're speaking the truth on my behalf. I have never consented to that, and no kind or amount of any of them taking accountability suddenly will make me question everything I already intuitively know about them. But I never believed Celine's necessarily even nearly as diabolically involved in conspiring to murder me with absolutely unconditional, unrestrained, malicious intent as Chloe. So maybe what I was seeing and hearing suggests Celine was actually defending me behind the scenes? Huh. I guess I shouldn't be surprised given my past experiences with her. Even if it was just a spiritual defending, she'd probably feel she needs to. After how I dealt with her spiritual assassination attempt, I felt extremely strongly in the past. December 22nd to January 19th has no special significance to me in any year or any context. I also don't consider the town I'm in to be of any kind of particularly special significance to me, neither in relation to that date range nor in general, at least beyond its obvious current relevance to me being in it. The year 2017 was brought up. That's the year that meetup with Kimmy and Jamie that I attended happened. It seems to me that Chloe's trying to shift all the blame onto my biological relatives entirely and avoid any real accountability, even remotely adequate to what she was doing for several years prior to that meetup, perhaps specifically through some kind of exploitation of lies related to the date range December 22nd to January 19th, and something that supposedly happened in or around the Greater Toronto Area during that time. From my perspective, if Chloe was so ready and willing to believe what my biological relatives and others from my past might have been communicating to her somehow long before I went to the Kimmy and Jamie Toronto meetup in 2017, and have it affect Chloe's behavior towards me how immensely as it must have in that case, then I'm absolutely convinced she knew long ago that I'm definitely not who they might have been trying to paint me as to her. I also absolutely refuse to believe that there isn't a massive part of her that seriously wanted horrible things my biological relatives might have been saying about me to be true all along from the very beginning of any kind of connection between us as well, entirely regardless of whether or not she actually could see if they were actually true or not with reasonable clarity at any point in time. She's probably trying to make it seem like framing me for some kind of diabolical plot related to pregnancy was entirely my biological relative's idea. In reality, I consider it very much possible, and in fact most likely, that it was actually much more so Chloe's idea than anyone else's. It seems Chloe's criticizing Kimmy, Jamie, Celine, and possibly also others for being very two-faced and lame, but I'd say she's herself so extremely those things, even more so than they might be, and perhaps Celine is really starting to realize that now. If I had to guess, Celine might be having such a hard time because of Chloe's egregious divination abuse that Celine has seriously felt someone's trying to get her murdered and drive her crazy while calling it all being awakened and loving her. Perhaps at once, Celine thought that was energy I was sending her, but she's now seeing it wasn't. Maybe Celine was getting weird spiritual things, possibly implying Kimmy and or Jamie were doing it, but then behavior she personally experienced from them didn't make it add up, and initially Celine thought it was because of me. It wasn't. It was Chloe all along, and she was framing me for it entirely against my consent and entirely to my detriment. Like, the Chloe and or Celine energy I'm getting right now is absolutely diabolical. Saying I shouldn't and don't have to let her in my life and become best friends or anything like that, but extremely deviously, passive aggressively being coercive and talking about relocating me and trying to force me to move somewhere else and acting like she's doing me some kind of favor as she's supposedly standing up for me in this unbelievably perverted, awakened, and loving, unhinged psychosis. Extremely ominously talking about something happening within 48 hours. That was yesterday morning, less than 48 hours ago. The something definitely didn't seem like anything good. Came off to me like I should expect to get murdered tonight. There was egregiously perverted and violating explicit dialogue around a supposed mutual understanding and mutual agreement. The egregiously blatant lie that I feel anything at all like that towards that energy was explicitly stated twice as essentially an irrefutable truth, not even the slightest bit in question. It was aggressively trying to force me to forgive and calling it very important, lying that those from my past didn't know consciously what they were doing to me, especially Chloe. Celine, perhaps not fully knowing, is being mixed into Chloe's energy and causing me to get attacked as if all the death magic I in reality believe should be returned to sender to hit Chloe Chankin is actually what I believe Celine to deserve. There was something about an impossible to make decision. I don't feel there's any impossible to make decision in my life right now. Absolutely none. Every decision I'm making feels easy, extremely easy. It's not making the decisions that's difficult at all. It's staying calm amongst the constant blood boiling rage I feel every time I see the next egregious lie that I'm increasingly being led to believe reveals absolutely diabolical plotting from multiple people, especially Chloe. There was something about spirits guiding me, but I've never needed encouragement for that. I've never been questioning if to trust any spirit's guidance or how much. And I've never been looking for some kind of vague spiritual comfort that I shouldn't worry. As far as I'm concerned, if I continue not to receive any decent direct communication privately to my official contact email and or official social medias from even one prominent influential public figure, I'm extremely concerned that every night death magic being sent towards me wrongly is going to result in me getting murdered because criminals are trying to cover up everything Chloe and many others have done to attempt to exploit me to literal death. There's absolutely nothing that any spirit could ever say that would at all actually decrease that worry. The realization that I'm being essentially forced to address all this to even remotely seem worthy of continuing to live was coming from Chloe and or Celine energy. So I heavily suspect at this point that Chloe is attempting to communicate with Celine either in the physical world and or spiritually through what effectively becomes divination abuse of some kind and trying to manipulate Celine into believing the narratives Chloe's trying to push about herself are even remotely objectively appropriate to subject me to. Celine obviously doesn't know how Chloe really sees me, or how my relatives see me, or even how Kimmy and Jamie really see me. Largely because Celine's been so heavily inclined to doubt everything I ever say and favor everyone attacking me, at least from what I can tell. For the record, I'm entirely unaware of if Chloe's actually directly communicating with Celine at all or not. I don't really know the details of how this information is going around. I just try to make my best guesses of the ultimate consequence being purported to attempt to discredit me. To be clear, when I talk about an and or energy involving anyone, that doesn't necessarily mean they're directly communicating in the physical world. They might or might not be. I consider myself as having considerable reason to suspect it's happening, but I don't consider my spiritual insights irrefutable evidence of it, nor something I'd necessarily say I'm 100% confident indicates direct communication between them in the physical world must be happening. Beyond all this, the Chloe and or Celine energy mentioned someone desperately trying to imitate me. I'm pretty sure that was referring to Jamie. On her last stream, she mentioned twice this strange belief she supposedly has that she's going through an awakening or something like that, while yapping about using people and being used. Pretty ridiculous if you ask me. I could tear apart a bunch of what she said in that stream, but there was only one thing I felt was perhaps particularly worth pointing out more immediately. A quick Google search of Sydney Sweeney, someone I'd never even heard of before in my entire life until that stream, revealed to me suggestions to also look at Jeff Bezos and Kim Kardashian. So Jamie mentioning Sydney Sweeney recently seems to be evidence of her knowing and intentional conspiring against me to attempt to discredit and sabotage me through joint efforts involving Sydney Sweeney, Jeff Bezos, and Kim Kardashian somehow, although I'm really not sure of the details. For all I know, Jamie's such a loser that she herself doesn't even really know much, if any, of the details, and she might just be mindlessly mentioning random garbage she comes across on social media for some kind of attention seeking, trend chasing thing. Given how Jamie felt the need to talk about Hollywood certified breasts, I suspect it has something to do with falsely framing me as secretly finding Celine inadequate as a partner because her breasts aren't better somehow. I imagine the false narratives are also likely simultaneously generally discrediting my attraction to Kimmy, and especially my statements about finding Kimmy's butt as attractive as I do because of my lack of showing more interest in Kim Kardashian's butt. My guess would be there are attempts to perhaps tie that all together to make me look like some extremely unhinged, disingenuous fraud that was attempting to somehow humiliate Kim Kardashian and Sydney Sweeney secretly all along in order to somehow target Jeff Bezos in what is likely a criminal manner. From what I can discern, it seems Jamie, being the massive fraud she is, has been attempting to frame herself as secretly helping me achieve that nefarious goal I'm being egregiously defamed as the claim I've had all along. She's trying to act like it makes any sense to believe I'd ever come to her for advice on anything, most likely making implications towards that plot I'm being framed as supposedly having had all along, entirely against my consent and entirely to my detriment. It seems she's involved in falsely framing me as at all particularly liking Sydney Sweeney and or Kim Kardashian, as if I've ever been attempting to use Jamie to perhaps get some kind of opportunity to have some kind of romantic and or sexual involvement with one or both of them, even if it's temporary. For the record, that's completely false. To be clear, I'm not calling Sydney Sweeney ugly, nor calling Kim Kardashian ugly, nor am I particularly trying to target Jeff Bezos for any kind of hate. After seeing Jamie say what she said publicly recently, I imagine Sydney Sweeney and Kim Kardashian might be jealous to some extent of Celine and Kimmy, but that's not something I see adequate reason for me to concern myself with seeing as a serious problem at this time. I imagine Jeff Bezos might be concerned about me potentially suing the Twitch platform given his financial investment in it, but that's also not something I see adequate reason for me to concern myself with seeing as a serious problem at this time. From my perspective, between Angels Kimmy, iGumdrop, Star Smitten, and Chloe Chan Kin, they're all behaving effectively like they'd always infinitely have rather caused World War III and effectively, most likely, ultimately destroy the entire world than ever see me at all happy and ever in my entire life get to engage in the objectively very much healthy, fair, loving, warm, tender, consensual, frequent, in-person physical sexual intimacy that I want and deserve with anyone I'd actually want and deserve it with, under circumstances I'd actually consider tolerable and favorable to me. It's so unfathomably, unbelievably diabolical that I'm literally being forced to explain all this in public so extremely meticulously just to defend myself from something I never even should have had to defend myself from if any of these four women were ever even remotely actually decent in the reality of their thoughts and actions towards and related to me. Even more diabolical is that while forcing me to have to explain myself so excruciatingly, painfully, constantly, when I never should have had to even just to survive, the fact that I feel at all compelled to explain myself at all is extremely egregiously being exploited through the inherent inclination most people would have to see me as definitely guilty of something and heavily question me as being a massive fraud simply because I actually feel the need to explain myself at all. And it's not some really quick open and shut kind of absolute domination shutdown in like 30 seconds or something like that. The projection of all the extremely disingenuous thoughts and intentions behind how they all consciously and intentionally treated me, entirely at my expense against my consent for their own selfish gain, is something I'm to this day being forced, entirely to my expense, against my consent, to bear the burden of the immense weight of. Literally, absolutely no amount of any of them and or anyone else at all simply defending me would ever come anywhere even close to adequate compensation to me for the unbelievable, hellish nightmare of nightmares I've had to go through even just to survive because of how horrible they've all been to me. It literally doesn't matter at all who it is, what they're saying, or what they claim it's doing to help me, especially when it comes to Kimmy, Jamie, Celine, and Chloe. I'm sure how they're trying to frame me as deserving of this endless absolute hell is in no short measure through how they managed to so egregiously abuse me into seeming absolutely horrible for how I've treated Celine. How the trio of Kimmy, Jamie, and Chloe treat me is so diabolical that it led Celine to believe I'm some unfathomably creepy pervert truly worthy of death, despite the fact that I'm absolutely certain they all know that's definitely not even close to being true. Celine probably to this day heavily questions it, simply because I wouldn't extremely pathetically chase her back at a time she seemed to be showing interest in me, and my connection with Kimmy was being made to seem so doomed as if I must be a fraud for not wanting or being willing to embrace abandoning my integrity in my connection with Kimmy in favor of hoping for getting what I've always wanted with Kimmy with Celine instead. There's clearly a serious jealousy dynamic between Kimmy and Celine, especially when it comes to me. It really shouldn't be so difficult to understand. If you want to consider my sexual preferences and what I look for in a life partner, I'd say it's rather obvious that the only individuals it makes any sense to believe would ever even possibly seriously have to compete for my affections would be Kimmy and Celine. They both have gorgeous, beautiful faces. They're both fully Korean. They both have a general body shape utmost to my liking. And they're both in a similar professional positioning to form a total package of being far more ideal for me to be in a committed long term relationship with than anyone else in every conceivable aspect of life. If I'm to consider them both reasonably similar mentally and emotionally to the extent that my personality is ultimately more or less equally compatible romantically and sexually with both of them, then the only substantial difference I can see realistically is that Kimmy has a bigger butt and Celine has bigger breasts. My integrity matters a lot to me, although Kimmy clearly questions that, and so it seems Kimmy and Celine have been extremely viciously, relentlessly fighting to sabotage each other a lot. My best guess would be it's because Celine felt like she was robbed of a fair chance at my affections by Kimmy because Kimmy positioned herself to meet me and make me invested in being with Kimmy to maintain my integrity early on with the Toronto meetup with Jamie. While it's perhaps flattering in a sense that Celine might secretly want to be with me extremely badly, I've seriously never regretted investing myself in being with Kimmy how I have. In all honesty, physical appearance is extremely important to me in picking a life partner, and Kimmy's bigger butt really does matter a lot to me as a very much non trivial reason why I see her as the unquestionably most physically attractive being I could ever fathom existing. It's so relevant and important that the only reason I'd ever say there was a time where I felt Chloe Chan Kin was more physically attractive than Celine is because despite Chloe not being Korean, her butt was genuinely so extremely physically attractive to me that to this day, Kimmy is the only woman I've ever seen who I'd say has a more attractive butt than Chloe did, even at her peak sexual appeal to me. There was a time when I'd say Chloe was the second most attractive being I could ever fathom existing after Kimmy, because much like Kimmy's breasts are absolutely lovely to me, it's not like Chloe's breasts were ever anything I'd consider less than ideal either. And I've also never found Chloe's face and or any other part of her body to be particularly unattractive or particularly unideal. I've never particularly wanted to compare, but if I absolutely had to list it, I'd say those I find most attractive in the entire world would be ranked Kimmy first, Celine second, and Lily third. Ultimately, unless Kimmy would literally rather end up in prison and or physically deceased beyond capacity for resuscitation rather than have the kind of connection I've always wanted with her, then as attractive as Celine is, I'd definitely rather be with Kimmy. Now, if Kimmy actually would rather be incarcerated and or killed rather than rub her latex-clad butt up against me for hours daily for all of eternity, meanwhile Celine is eager to do that with me and just really upset that I seem fixed on obsessing over Kimmy hopelessly rather than embrace Celine, then I'd have to see irrefutable evidence of those things before believing it. If I see Celine explicitly cancel Kimmy and Jamie in public and have no issue causing their lives to get completely destroyed while Celine cries that she's been deprived of all the intimacy with me she's wanted for so long that Kimmy and Jamie were so unbelievably diabolically denying her of having with me all along, then at that point, I guess I'd have to seriously consider at least giving Celine a chance to fly out to Toronto to personally meet me and stuff and see how we feel about each other. In that case, I'd actually feel really bad that I've ever left Celine feeling like she's at all inadequate as a life partner for me simply because her butt isn't exactly like Kimmy's butt. I'd want her to know I'd absolutely love to privately prove to her that there's really nobody else I could ever fathom existing who I'd ever rather be with. I'd promise I'd never intentionally try to hurt her at all out of any kind of resent that she doesn't look exactly like Kimmy, and I wouldn't ever pressure her to artificially enhance her butt and or any other part of her body either. But unless some serious craziness is seriously going to happen in the near future, where it's the kind of thing I just said, where Celine's extremely brutally, viciously, unapologetically, absolutely destroying Kimmy's and Jamie's lives to save me from the eternal torment of Kimmy, Jamie, and Chloe endlessly conspiring and attempting to murder me to cover up how unbelievably diabolical their behavior towards me has always actually been, I'm sticking to insisting on Kimmy reaching out to me and treating me how I believe she should. If you ask me, I honestly really don't know whether or not Kimmy seriously would rather end up in prison and or dead than happily embrace the kind of life I want to have with her. At this point, it honestly seems to me like she'd rather end up going the prison and or death route, with how reluctant she seems to be to at all directly communicate with me properly. I'd really like to believe she's this extremely dreamy, ultimate fantasy of mine come to reality, and that I'm right about to receive direct communication from her privately, where she's pouring her heart out to me and rushing to see me and stuff. But I also face the extremely painful reality of having to recognize there's absolutely no real evidence to actually suggest to me that that's true. For all I know, Kimmy might actually be this absolutely diabolical demon trying to deprive Celine of an absolutely heavenly existence, being my lover and life partner, and she's somehow managed to manipulate everyone into believing I'm some absolutely diabolical, demonic menace, disingenuous fraud, maniac that absolutely unconditionally would already have gotten Kimmy, Jamie, and Chloe incarcerated and or killed and be dating Celine if I was actually being completely sincere about my sexual preferences. To make sure I'm being extremely clear, I'm seriously not at all wavering on my integrity. Just like how I'd never start chasing Lily, there's absolutely no point where I ever start pursuing Celine like I did with Kimmy. Never. I'm not going to suddenly be willing to compromise my integrity just because Celine isn't currently in a clearly extremely serious long term public relationship, even if Celine's even more physically attractive to me than Lily is. And that's not because I'm lying about my sexual preferences at all. I'm just not a fraud. The situation where I felt basically forced to give Celine a chance for her to take supposed feelings for me more seriously in the past was an extremely complicated situation, and the situation hasn't gotten any less complicated since. Me acknowledging the reality that Celine's so extremely attractive to me that I can definitely see myself enjoying being with her infinitely more than being with anyone else ever, specifically under an extremely specific set of rather wild circumstances, doesn't mean I'm going back on anything I've said at all. Even in a situation where Celine effectively helps me destroy Kimmy, Jamie, and Chloe's lives in rightful retribution for them being exceedingly unacceptably diabolical towards me all this time, Celine still would have to be the one to reach out to me, similarly to how Kimmy would have to, and pour her heart out to me and explain things in open communication between me and her privately so we'd feel comfortable and safe enough with each other to take our relationship further in a healthy and loving direction where we both feel seen, understood, respected, and loved. If she's unwilling and or unable for any reason to take the absolutely necessary actions to make me feel it's actually at all appropriate to seriously entertain her having such desires towards me, Celine's still effectively just as utterly hopeless at ever being with me as everyone else is. And that's seriously never changing. Literally no matter what. Also, for the record, regardless of how Celine acts, I'd still never want children with anyone ever, including but most certainly not limited to Celine. Again, I separate my desire for sexual intimacy from any kind of desire to have children. While I'd want sexual intimacy with Celine more or less just as much as I'd have wanted it with Kimmy under the correct circumstances, I've never been trying to hurt anyone to get those desires satisfied, neither directly nor indirectly. I've never been trying to enable and or facilitate anyone to hurt others and then try to leave me and or my life partner facing negative karma in order to have sexual intimacy, or even just the potential for sexual intimacy with anyone. Some other things perhaps worth mentioning. Chloe might be lying that I have some kind of plans to text her
Completely false. I've literally never texted her in my entire life. I don't even know her number. I never have, and I don't want to know it ever either at this point. Whether anyone considers any of it good, bad, or neutral, I take absolutely no responsibility for anything that anyone has ever texted Chloe. It was not me, ever, nor anyone ever behaving on my behalf at all with any knowledge and or consent whatsoever from me to do so. I never lose any sleep over any of the things I've ever said about Chloe. At least not over worrying about hurting her feelings or somehow having wronged her or behaved inappropriately towards her, that's for sure. I actually never lose sleep over any of the things I've ever said about anyone. If I ever lose sleep at all, it's because there are multiple scumbags involved in trying to absolutely destroy my life entirely unjustly and murder me to cover it up, and I'm usually working to defend myself from that actively in such cases. I literally never attribute any lack of sleep I might experience to me having wronged anyone and deserving to lose sleep at all as a result. Literally never. And I haven't been experiencing any stabbing pains in my body anywhere, nor digestive problems. Not at all. Also, I see reason to suspect that Leslie might be lying that I'm secretly texting her and have been for a very long time. Completely false. I've said this before. I've literally only ever sent Leslie like 2 or 3 text messages in my entire life, and I haven't sent her any for years now. Nor do I have any desire or inclination or anything I'd consider an adequate reason to do so. Nothing I've ever said to her was flirting with her, nor at all compromising my integrity, and I've long lost access to the numbers I once used to text her. I see reason to suspect that someone trying to criminally impersonate me and or somehow frame me for texting hateful things towards Leslie has been love bombing her and doing all kinds of strange things and trying to blame me for it somehow or something like that. Seems likely to me it's Edison trying to dump his negative karma for being a player and dating and getting engaged to Leslie when he probably had some kind of secret familial commitment to Kimmy onto me as if I was the reason he did it or something. Maybe that's why Jessica was violating my energy so much. Maybe Edison's been harassing Leslie and telling her that I want Jessica instead, or trying to convince Leslie to get Jessica to do certain things to offer Leslie some kind of benefit from me somehow. That very well might also relate to Edison, Leslie, and Jessica doing some kind of divination abuse related to me in general in some kind of triangle of trust dynamic as well. Again, all always having been happening entirely against my consent and to my detriment.